So let me go ahead and talk about the interaction of labor demand and labor supply. And let's go ahead and think we have two restaurants out there, City Walk and Whistling Willie's Pizza. And they each have different marginal revenue functions for different levels of workers. And so, with City Walk is the first worker produces or adds $35 of revenue, second worker adds 30, so on and so forth. Whistling Willie's has its own and different marginal revenue function for the different workers. So let's go ahead and first think, what is going to happen if initially City Walk has 2 workers and Whistling Willie has 5 workers? Well, total sort of production at City Walk is 65, 35 plus 30. And total production at Whistling Willie's is 64 plus 32 gets us to 96 plus 16 gets us to like 112, I think maybe. 112, 120, 124, I think. And we'll have to double check the math on that. So that gives us sort of an estimate of the total amount of production that's happening in the economy, because marginal revenue product does indicate how much value each worker is creating. Now, who is going to have an incentive to stay where they are? Well, or who's going to have an incentive to act differently? Notice that for City Walk, a third worker would be worth $25 to them. They'd prefer to get a third worker for less, but they would be willing to offer this worker number 5 here at Whistling Willie's, say $20 to come over. And since Whistling Willie's, the 5th worker only produces $4 for them, Whistling Willie's isn't going to be able to match, or shouldn't be willing to match, that $20 wage offer. So in fact, we would go down to 3 workers at City Walk and 4 workers at Whistling Willie's as City Walk poaches a worker away from Whistling Willie's. So what happens there? Well, notice we gained $25 worth of production here, and we lost $4 worth of production there. So total production should now be 90 at City Walk, and should be 120 now at Whistling Willie's. So we've increased total production in society by having the firm that's willing to pay the worker more hire the worker. Okay, so the marginal revenue product indicates the willingness to pay, the maximum willingness to pay for a given worker. And when firms compete for workers, and that causes workers to go where they're most valued, that increases total production. It's also very nice for the workers, of course. What about, so are we content where we are right now? Well, City Walk would be willing to pay up to $20 for a 4th worker. Whistling Willie's, that 4th worker is only worth $8 to them. So they, in fact, are not going to be able to match City Walk's wage offer of, say, $15. And so City Walk is going to poach worker number 4 away from Whistling Willie's. And now Whistling Willie's has 3 workers and City Walk has 4 workers. What about now? Well, City Walk has a maximum willingness to pay for a 5th worker of $15. And Whistling Willie's, this 3rd worker is worth $16. So now we're at an equilibrium, because City Walk would only be willing to offer $15 to poach this worker, and Whistling Willie's is willing to match that. So we're at an equilibrium here. And what we'll notice here is that this equilibrium, in fact, maximizes the total production. So this brings up an important point. Wages are what cause firms to ration labor to its highest value uses. And that's kind of subtle, and maybe you don't think of your wage that way, but think about how wasteful with your labor a firm would be if they didn't have to pay you. The fact that they have to pay you means that they try to only use your labor for valuable purposes. Another way of saying this is that in equilibrium, when we have a labor demand curve where the demand for labor comes from the marginal revenue product, we have the wage here and the quantity of labor on this axis, and there's some supply of labor out there based upon workers' willingness to work, the equilibrium wage equals the marginal revenue product of the marginal worker. So the equilibrium wage equals the marginal revenue product. And this idea is what we call the theory of marginal productivity. That in a competitive market economy, if there are no important market imperfections, and we'll come to those later, in a competitive market economy, wages and other factor prices, like the rate of interest or the price of land, reflect the marginal revenue productivity of those factors of production. Now, you may remember a long time ago we talked about what's called the diamond water paradox. And the diamond water paradox was essentially this idea that water is necessary for human life, and yet it's very cheap, and diamonds are not necessary at all for human life, and yet they're very expensive. So how do we explain this seeming contradiction between sort of the real value of something and its market price? And you may remember that the answer essentially goes something like this, that although the demand curve for water is huge, because water is necessary for human life, the supply is also huge, so that its equilibrium price is relatively low. Whereas diamonds are much less important. Their demand curve is farther to the left, but the supply is very limited. So this is the supply of diamonds, and this is the demand for diamonds. This is the demand for water. This is the supply of water. So we have an equilibrium here. So the price reflects the equilibrium marginal value of the two different things. Or put another way, price reflects scarcity relative to human wants and needs. The same thing can be true about, say, for instance, the income of farm workers versus something like computer programmers. You know, farm workers are hugely important because we all need food. But they're also very plentiful in supply, so that the equilibrium wage for farm workers is very low because the marginal value of having one more farm worker is fairly low because we're already pretty well saturated with food. The marginal value of having one more person to build one more app for Facebook may actually be higher because, first of all, those people who can build those apps are scarcer than farm workers. And second, well, actually, essentially that's it. The fact that they're very scarce offsets the fact that the Facebook app is in fact a less necessary thing than food. So this would be our equilibrium wage of a programmer, and this would be our equilibrium wage of a farm worker. So we're not saying that occupations with low wages are unimportant occupations. What we're saying is that the incremental value of having one more person doing those occupations is lower than the incremental value of one more person doing that because we're so saturated with food already. The advantage of having yet more food production is relatively low for us. So again, making sure I summarize it, the theory of marginal productivity is that in equilibrium, each factor of production is paid its marginal revenue product. When people see this, they often have two reactions. Reaction one that people often have is that theory of marginal revenue productivity, or theory of marginal product, proves market outcomes are fair. Okay, so that's one reaction you might have. You might go, well, what I think is fair is that people are paid their productivity, and therefore the market delivers pay proportional to marginal revenue productivity, and that's that. Maybe that's true, but then a question would arise: how much do people deserve their productivity? So people's productivity comes from lots and lots of sources. It may come from, having a good education and so on and so forth. It may come from having natural gifts. If people receive their natural gifts or their high levels of education through either genetic or social inheritance, how much do they deserve that or not? So I think if you want to assert that the theory of marginal productivity proves that market outcomes are fair, you would have to say that people completely deserve their productivity, even if they had no particular role in creating that productivity for themselves. And maybe we believe that, or maybe we don't, but there's at least an unstated assumption that you would need to arrive at this conclusion here. The other reaction that people have out there is that the theory of marginal revenue productivity says that market outcomes are fair, and they don't believe that. And in fact, the theory of marginal revenue productivity says nothing about whether or not the market outcome is fair. We might think that there are certain fundamental rights or fundamental things that people are entitled to, just as a fact, just as a matter of being human beings, that everyone is entitled to have enough to eat or some level of medical care or something like that. The theory of marginal revenue productivity doesn't say anything about that. It just says that people's earnings in the marketplace are proportional to their productivity. And we may believe that we should have people contribute according to their productivity, and maybe they should receive according to their needs. Theory of marginal revenue productivity doesn't say there's anything wrong with that. So we just want to realize that this is our prediction of how incomes will be determined in the market outcome. And we're not saying anything yet about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing.